drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. You are about to listen to the full episode, but there will be 1 to 2 short ads immediately following this before the conversation. If you would like to hear ad-free episodes and get early access before they release more widely, become a paid subscriber at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. Becoming a paid subscriber is a way to directly support my efforts, allowing me to make more episodes and higher quality episodes, and also helping to free up my time so that I can spend more of it on doing research and synthesizing results from the podcast and from the literature so that I can do more things like writing on the Substack, putting more content into the newsletter, and getting these things out more frequently. So if you want to support the show and get ad-free episodes, go to mindandmatter.substack.com. Hey everyone, a great way to support my efforts is to visit my support page at mindandmatter.substack.com. A link to that page is in the episode description, or you can search for it on the Substack page itself. The support page has an up-to-date list of my affiliate partners. These are companies I work with, and if you buy those products through those links or using the discount codes provided, those will get you a great deal on a variety of products related to optimizing physical, metabolic, or mental health and vitality. These are all products I use myself, and some of them are directly related to podcast episodes or formulated by Mind and Matter guests. For example, there's a great product called Keto Citra, formulated by a kidney biologist who is on episode number 186. It contains the ketone body BHB together with several minerals in a precise ratio formulated with kidney health in mind. There are also links to products like physical technology devices to track your metabolic health, digital applications to help you find and learn about food and consumer products, and more. One product I use every day is the AquaTrue water filter. I recommend this to everyone because it gets everything out of your drinking water: heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, microplastics, you name it. Other charcoal or gravity-based filters that a lot of people use don't get everything out, they just get some of the stuff out. So I really like the AquaTrue product. You can look for a link to my affiliate partners on my support page or directly in the episode description to this episode, or you can go to mindandmatter.substack.com to find it there. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Do you want to start off by just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what you study?
Sure. I'm Joe Bass. I am the chief of endocrinology, metabolism, and molecular medicine at Northwestern University in the Feinberg School of Medicine. And I wear sort of 2 hats. My role as a scientist is directing a research group focusing on the mechanistic intersection between circadian biology, sleep, and metabolic systems, broadly writ. And so it's a systems biology laboratory where we ask questions related to the integration of brain and behavior down to organ systems that are involved primarily in metabolism, but extending into other cognate areas, including inflammation and so forth. And then I'm also a clinician. I work as an endocrinologist still, and as a division head with some administrative and educational responsibilities in the medical school, and overseeing a large clinical enterprise where we have patient care, management of the wide range of endocrine disorders, and some of them are related to the physiologic systems that we work on in our research, but not linked in the sense that I'm not a clinical investigator per se. I'm really a molecular biologist using genetic tools in experimental animals, asking questions that provide an framework for our understanding of physiology and behavior.
Yeah, yeah. And so you have this really interesting set of things you think about at the nexus of circadian biology and all of the rhythms of biology that come with that, sleep itself, and then also metabolism, fairly broadly speaking. And I think we'll probably talk today mostly about how different systems in the body, the brain, other organs, stay synchronized and sort of communicate with each other via the nervous system, via hormones and things like this. Maybe talk about sleep a little as well. But do you want to just start off very high level here? Just give people a basic sense for the, let's call it the master control system in the brain for circadian biology. What does that look like at a basic level?
Sure. I mean, I think that a good way of thinking of it, if I present in a talk and organize that response, I would begin by emphasizing or illustrating what the principle of a circadian system is, which is well illustrated by an experiment that was done in the early 1800s by a plant biologist named de Moran, who had observed, as did, was known that the leaves of a plant called the mimosa plant open and close each day and night. So they exhibited a periodicity that was observed to align with the day-night cycle. But the question as to whether or not this opening and closing of the leaf movements of the plant was an intrinsic phenomena that was a property of the plant or an extrinsic environmental force. It was thought to be sort of, witchcraft days, and maybe it was a magnetic force or some other kind of mysterious force, could be acting on the plant in such a way. And so he did a very basic experiment. He just put a dark box over the plant and demonstrated by doing so that the leaves continued to open and close with the exact same periodicity that they exhibited when they were exposed to light and dark. So when they were in the regular environment, light-dark cycle, the leaf movements conformed to the rising and setting of the sun. They were placed in the dark box and they exhibited the same periodicity. So that experiment established the concept that all photosensitive species on the surface of the earth that are exposed to sunlight exhibit or possess an intrinsic time-keeping mechanism that actually is set to the rotation of the earth on its axis. And that principle, I think is really crucial to keep in mind when we start talking about things like sleep and much more complex things in the context of human biology or human medicine, because it's a really fundamental property of evolution that, is present across four kingdoms of life. So it's in fungi, it's in the animal kingdom, it's in plants, and it has to do with some sort of survival advantage throughout evolution of mechanisms to tell time according to the rising and the setting of the sun. And whereas, in the plant, this is a property that we now understand to be related to molecules in the leaf that detect sunlight, that are photosensitive. In animals, which are obviously opaque and our internal organs are not exposed to light, we have a central nervous system. And so in the animal kingdom, the entrainment to the light cycle is a responsibility of the central nervous system. And there's only one place that's really proven to execute this function, which is the retina. So light reaches the eye, not through color vision, rod cone vision, but through a different system that is light sensing, blue wavelength light sensing. And those signals enter a part of the brain that actually is intimately tied to the part of the brain that controls appetite and sleep and all of our hormones that relate to reproduction and the classic factors that we think of, such as stress hormones, glucocorticoid, thyroid hormone, and the like. So all of these, the part of the brain where light enters and disseminates signals to other areas in the brain and in the central nervous system, is anatomically juxtaposed with those centers which were discovered to regulate neuroendocrine systems and energy balance. So that's one level in thinking about it, that from an anatomic standpoint and from an evolutionary standpoint, animals possess this molecular property that is present in all species that are exposed to light. And because there's a central nervous system in the animal kingdom, this is the place where light sensing occurs. And interestingly, in higher organisms, these parts of the brain are very much tied to parts that also are responsible for whole body energy balance and metabolism.
So this part of the brain, the hypothalamus, is closely linked to the retina. It's the part of our body that detects sunlight and external light can hook into all of these other circuits in the hypothalamus that control things like hormones and endocrine function, sleep-wake cycles, and all of these things. What happens when you do an experiment in animals similar to the one you described in plants earlier, and you just put them completely in the dark and they can't detect with their retinas sunlight or external light? What happens to their rhythms and their behavior?
Well, those kinds of experiments were done. They're called bunker experiments. They were done in an era in the circadian field before the molecular biology era, which began in the 1970s. So prior to that, in the period around the Great Wars and just after that, there were experiments where humans, for instance, were placed in constant darkness, constant conditions. And what happens in that circumstance, one can measure the clock function because body temperature is a readout of what the intrinsic clock property might be. So the oscillation of body temperature follows the oscillation of other core signals where the clock projects, so such as the sleep-wake cycle. And in addition, in humans, melatonin peaks during the period when we sleep. So the hormonal system and the temperature are outputs that tell us what the response is. And so what happens is, over a period of time, the endogenous cycle of the clock, which in the sunlight is entrained to when the sun rises each morning, in humans, the period of the clock is a little bit longer than 24-hour rotation of the Earth. So it's a little bit longer. So it's a little inaccurate. And so the observed temperature rhythm and light and melanopsin rhythms exhibit lengthening eventually. And then when there's no light present, eventually rhythms can desynchronize. But the initial observation is the lengthening to the phase where the rhythm or the length of the period that is programmed by the animal. So now it turns out that in mice, if you do the same experiment, they actually have a somewhat shorter periodicity that is programmed by their brain clock than humans. So somewhat shorter than 24 hours. So you observe the opposite. And if you look at mice, you can use wheel running. That's what we use classically. You can use other readouts such as temperature. And the period length being shorter than 24 hours causes a shortening each day. So the rhythm drifts to the shorter time frame.
Yeah. And that probably actually speaks to a fundamental property that relates body size and metabolism. So you're saying that humans were bigger than mice, obviously. We actually have a natural intrinsic period that's a little bit longer than 24 hours, which means if you put a human into the darkness, it will maintain this rhythm, but it will drift. It'll drift away from the timing of the light dark cycle outside if they can't see it. But mice and smaller body animals have a different metabolic rate than we do, and you're saying that they actually have a somewhat shorter period than the 24-hour light cycle.
So we have to separate the discussion of metabolic rate and metabolism and body size from the discussion of the clock. So
Mm.
these are not analogous in the way that you're inferring. So the size of the animal, as far as I know, is not linearly related to the periodicity, the length of the period, the period length. So it just so happens that mice are somewhat shorter. I think the way to think of it is not so much how does this link to body size and energetics, which has been shown to relate to the biology of growth factors in animals of different size. So the longitudinal growth relates to metabolic rate and longevity and these sorts of things. But the periodicity that is set by the brain is not directly proportional to the size of the animal or the species per se. It just happens to be an interesting feature of the main experimental model that we use, which is the mouse, or flies are also used, Drosophila. And the important thing, though, is that this imprecision in the clock, meaning the deviation from the natural light, the actual rotation of the Earth, the 24-hour periodicity, is thought to give some degree of flexibility so that the clock can entrain across the seasons as the day length changes.
Mm-hmm.
But the signal that entrains the clock in all species is the point at which the sun rises.
Mm-hmm.
So although day length changes, so the 24-hourness of the clock remains constant, and the fact that there is this you might call it flexibility or imprecision in the relationship between 24-hourness in sort of geophysical time as opposed to biologic time enables the flexibility so that the clock can re-entrain across the seasons according to when changing. And that's the same thing that happens to us if we travel across time zones. What happens is, we're exposed to sun rising at different times. So if we go from Chicago to Europe, the sun, it's the time at which the sun rises and its change, and that directly signals to the retina where the beginning of the day is. And what happens is we re-entrain to that new time zone. Now, for each 1 hour change in time zone, it takes about a day for the whole system to re-entrain. So if we go 8 hours to a new time zone, that's why we feel sort of out of time. It does take a full day, the sort of physical properties of how the harmonics work, to realign those oscillations to the new sunrise.
So the rule of thumb is about a day for every hour you travel.
Our time zone, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Hour shift.
So the sort of what we might think of or call the imprecision of the clock, it's not exactly 24 hours. This is actually a reflection of like inherent flexibility that's baked into the system, because under natural conditions, it needs to be flexible because the day length for most animals actually needs to adjust throughout the seasons and throughout the year.
Yeah, but what's interesting and sort of kind of abstract is that our clock doesn't adjust to day length per se. It adjusts to the time when the sun is rising. So it remains essentially 24 hours.
Right.
But what shifts is the time at which that day begins. And so that, if you think of crops, in plants, photosynthesis is very tightly timed by the clock system. So the elaboration of the machinery to harvest sunlight is a very strongly circadian phenomena in plants. They express the factors that are involved in the oxygenic phase of photosynthesis, during the period when the sun is available. And they undergo nitrogen fixation during the dark period. So the elaboration of the photosynthetic machinery in plants is very strongly driven by the clock. So whereas, so the way I think of it, in a sense, is to use the analogy of plants or eubacteria, where a lot of the original observations of the phenomena of timing, derive. And in both cases, especially plants, it's pretty intuitive that there is an advantage from the standpoint of the conservation of energy or the optimization of energy harvesting, because the plant needs to align the machinery to harvest energy from sunlight at the time when the sun is shining. And so I think from an evolutionary standpoint, there's a sort of analogy that in humans, a lot of the biology of the circadian system and its coupling to metabolism can be thought of as analogous to plants, in that there are these distinct phases that we undergo as humans, where when we are awake, we are acquiring energy, eating, undergoing reproductive function, etc., behaving. And then during the phase where we're asleep, we need to mobilize, store fuel that has been stored. So in humans, it's an energy cycle. In animals, it's an energy cycle, just as it is in other organisms, such as photosynthetic, forms of life.
Yeah. And so what are some of the classic observations that have been made from breaking core components of the molecular clock as it relates to what we would call metabolism or metabolic health? So I've had Joseph Takahashi on the podcast before, and we've covered a lot more of the molecular biology side of this. I'll let you decide how much detail we should go into there. But, if you start to look at some of the mutations that people have made in the past, other than the ones that break like the clock, like I'm sure there's mutations that shift when the ability of the clock to entrain to light and things like this. What are some of the observations that have been made with respect to what we would consider metabolic health related phenotypes?
Yeah, so I think another way to frame that is to say, okay, if we look at the origin of the clock story in the kind of modern era of biology, which was the idea that genes control behavior. So Seymour Benzer did this famous experiment. I'm sure Joe probably explained that they had the idea that genes were controlling behavior, but so to reduce that, to create a system where one could test that idea, they had the idea from understanding that mutagenesis could affect, gene, the normal code in the genome, right? So Seymour Benzer and Ron Knopka, as graduate student, mutagenized the fly and looked for flies that exhibited altered periodicity in their behavior, which happened to be eclosion of the fly and its emergence from the pupal, from its case each day. But by doing so, those period length mutants led to, when the tools became available, the identification through meiotic mapping of the place in the genome where those mutations had occurred. And they were identified as occurring in a locus that had been termed the period locus. And that was a repressor. So that came from flies, and the Nobel Prize in 2017 was awarded there. Now, Joe did an experiment with a group in Madison in which mice were mutagenized. The missing piece from the fly was that these were the genes encoding repressors. They were transcriptional repressors. So mutagenesis in the mouse, and all of the study was done with the idea in mind to look at sleep-wake cycles or look at periodic behaviors, okay? So in the mouse, this was done using screening for wheel-running behavior. Mutations were found, and it happened to be a transcriptional activator, which was called clock, soon shown to be a dimeric factor that partners with a protein called BMAL. Okay, so clock BMAL formed the driving arm of this positive-negative loop that the positive end, clock B-mal, induced the expression of the repressors in the negative end, the purr and the cries. Now, but just by coincidence, when I came to Northwestern, um, most of the analysis of these, the period of molecular discovery, which was coming to its peak at the end of the 90s, was around the time that I became interested in the story because of the genetic approach. And there was a sort of convergence of ideas from metabolism and energy balance, because this was a similar approach that had been used to identify the hormone system regulating body weight or neuroendocrine systems when the product of the obese gene was found by Jeff Friedman, who cloned leptin. And so here we had developments that in my area, had revealed a whole new biology of hormones and brain pathways that control energy balance that was historically coming to fruition around the same time that clocks were discovered as molecules controlling behavior. And it turns out that as those, we had the mice now that had abnormalities, genetic abnormalities in various of these proteins in the core clock. And coincidentally, it was observed that they had differences in body size. And so that was the time that I came. And so the key experiments that we did were the sort of basic experiments from the field of endocrinology, which was just to ask whether in the presence of a high-fat diet, animals that had mutations in the clock machinery were able to maintain energy balance, because our thinking about the control of energy balance really derived from the discovery of leptin and a whole different set of pathways from what the clock system had come from, which was really a focus on what regulates sleep and sleep-wake cycles. But when we did that experiment, we found that the animals with mutations and abnormalities in these sleep-wake regulatory pathways actually were no longer able to regulate their body weight. So they had obesity. So that said to us a number of things. It said maybe the molecular pathways that are coding sleep-wake cycles are somehow intercoupled, interdigitated with those factors controlling energy balance. But the real, I think, to me as an endocrine thinker, clue that was the earliest observation that really opened this up for us was that although we saw a variety of changes that one would expect with obesity, so the animals gained weight, they got fat in their liver, they had some of the symptoms of like classic obesity in the population, but what they didn't have was what's called hyperinsulinemia, so that they exhibited the absence of overproduction of the hormone insulin. So for those of us who think about kind of how endocrine systems work, not just in the brain, but also in our tissues, we had also come of age at a time when the earliest gene mutations that cause diabetes had been identified. And those also were transcription factors that were mutated in humans that had some similarity to the factors that actually were discovered to regulate the clock. Mm-hmm. So I knew that because I came from the groups where this kind of work was going on. And so I sort of hypothesized that maybe these transcription factors that regulate the clock are operating in the pancreas in a sort of coordinated way, but autonomously to regulate insulin. That was very important because there are many things that can mess up an organism, and maybe secondarily there's an effect on body weight or some abnormality in feeding. But it's a very unusual and specific phenomena to say, here's a system that is affecting energy balance, but it's also very specifically affecting the production of a hormone whose origin we have great knowledge about. We know that it's made in a cell in the pancreas called the beta cell, and that cell exhibits some very similar features to neurons in the hypothalamus. It has action potentials. It releases insulin in vesicles that are regulated a lot like neurotransmitters in neurons. So it acts a lot more like a neuron in a sense than it does a liver cell, for instance.
Right.
And so that was a really, to me, that was like a guiding principle. And eventually that using genetics, we were able to kind of um, prove that that was the case, that the clock machinery is not simply a set of factors operating in the brain, but it's actually in peripheral cells exerting very specific effects to coordinate the entirety of our metabolic um, enterprise, so to speak, or system, in such a way as to align our metabolism with the external light dark environment.
Yeah, yeah. So you said that like there's this sort of fundamental thing that needs to happen, whether or not we're talking about humans or rodents or plants, which is you need to do energy acquisition stuff one part of the day and energy mobilization stuff another part of the day. And if you think about it, right, it should make pretty good sense. Like when energy is available to be acquired, that's when you need to go get it. And then you're going to need to do other things with it other times of the day when you're also going to want to be behaviorally inactive or quiescent. At nighttime, you might want to be inactive if that's a dangerous time for you to be out and about, or vice versa, depending on the organism. Some are nocturnal, some are diurnal. But also, we're going to have this problem to think about of we have to be able to coordinate all of the different organ systems, each of which it turns out has their own clock. So can you talk a little bit more about that piece now? There's not just a clock in the brain, and it's not just the brain communicating time to the rest of the organs. There's actually clocks that are running in all of the other organ systems, and those all ultimately need to be aligned and coordinated with one another.
Right. I want to make one sort of corollary point, so to speak, from the theorem that clocks are aligning with the purpose of energy sort of optimization. It's important to keep in mind, and I would say not quite as well, the logic for which is not quite as well worked out as the energy sort of hypothesis, so to speak. But there's clear evidence in plants in particular that that sunlight not only, provides energy, but it also has DNA damaging properties. So the clock actually in plants, so to speak, is encoded by a set of molecules that have dual purpose, which is that they function not only to tell time, but they are actually also core DNA repair enzymes. So the cryptochromes, which were discovered as DNA photolyase enzymes, are expressed in a periodic way because they're part of the clock machinery, but they have this enzymatic function in plants to correct DNA damage.
Got it.
So clearly in plants, the other evolutionary pressure has been to escape the DNA damaging effects of sunlight. Now, there is an abundance of evidence that such a process and concept also applies to the evolutionary sort of convergence of mechanisms involved in DNA repair and even cell cycle control and timing, 24-hour timing. But it's not as quite as clear and analogous as it is in plants. So in the plant kingdom, very clearly, clocks are not just for energy, but they're also for protecting DNA.
Right. Because because for plants, they get their food from sunlight, but also sunlight is damaging. So there has to be this linkage between energy acquisition stuff and DNA protection, oxidative stress stuff.
Correct. And the same is also true in the animal, in other kingdoms of life, but less direct. And so it doesn't work as well to explain something like endocrine systems. So I'm more specialized in my understanding of how the question you asked me about synchrony and what the different clocks are. But I want to just put on the map that there are additional layers to this conversation which address issues related to nucleotide metabolism, DNA repair, and so forth. And, as we develop a deeper understanding of the biochemistry of the system internally in the cell, these themes recur. They don't form as complete a sort of etiologic explanation for how clocks are functioning, but they're clearly emerging themes in biochemistry as you get deeper into understanding clocks. It's not simply about energy storage and release. We have to keep in mind these other core, probably very fundamental properties of the molecules, even in animals. So this is relevant. So for instance, FAD, which is a cofactor for DNA repair functions of the cryptochromes, is also, active in nucleotides are also, active in regulating clock proteins in animals in different ways. But you asked me the original question about how do we think of the clock? We call it, I think it's really the way of articulating this would be to hearken to the area of systems biology, where we think of not just a gene and a cell, but we think of where that cell operates within the context of organs or whole animals. So I think we already started with the idea that clocks were classically studied and probably best understood because of their functions in the brain. But, this observation that the pancreas clock is essential for the release of insulin began a whole field of first of all, recognizing the physiologic activity of clocks, but I should also acknowledge important contributions of many people, particularly Uli Schibler, who was a biochemist in Geneva and had performed studies that showed that two key studies that he did. One was to take fibroblasts, skin cells, and place them in a dish and expose them to glucocorticoid, which is a hormone, a steroid hormone, that actually affects the transcription of these clock factors. And he showed that even fibroblasts in a dish exhibit transcriptional oscillations that are self-sustained and possess the periodicity of 24 hours and other features of clocks, such as
so what you're saying is you can dissociate cells from an animal, from a tissue system, put them in a dish, and they will still have a rhythmicity in terms of the pattern of genes coming on and off.
That's right. And so it's a general property of cells, possibly all cells in animals. Not there are some exceptions, but nearly all cells. And other people made important contributions to this. Of course, I can't list all of them, but in the liver, Uli's lab showed that if you change when an animal eats, you change the time when these clocks are oscillating in the liver. So eating time is one of the factors that affects these clocks that are all over the body, right? And so so many organs that I think of as being involved in nutrient absorption and metabolism, intermediary metabolism, we would call it, such as the liver and adipose tissue that stores fat. These organs are very plastic with respect to eating time. So that explains why, again, if you fly from Chicago or New York to Europe or to Japan, what happens is two different things. One is you are exposed to the sun rising at a different time, as we discussed. That is resetting the clock in the brain. That's the process that takes about an hour, about a day for every hour time zone you shift. Okay. Now, you also are eating at a new time. Okay. So the food consumption re-entrains clocks in the liver, for instance, much more rapidly than the 1 hour per day. So what's going on then is that the clock in the liver is fairly plastic, but the clock in the brain is less so. And so you establish this desynchrony or misalignment between the phase at which your brain is oscillating and your liver. And that is a condition that not only occurs when you fly in a jet across time zones, but very commonly in modern society. So for instance, blue light, which is emitted by computer screens and we're exposed to and kids are playing on it, that light tricks the retina because the cells in the retina that detect sunrise are sensitive to blue light. And so we scramble the information in the retina by exposure to light at odd times of day in modern society. Of course, electric light, was only invented about 100 or so years ago, right? And widely available. And so natural light cycles, which are present for farming, hunter-gatherer societies and more long-term over evolution, don't have this property. Candlelight doesn't cause resetting of the clock. But if you go to a factory on a shift work, or you're an emergency room worker working in an emergency room and you work 3 nights shifts where you're going into the lighting that's in the emergency room, which has plenty of blue light exposure, and you're working for 3 nights, and then you go back and you flip and you rest, and you're going back with your family to a different cycle. You are going under a sort of insult to the endogenous system where the brain is detecting the light signals, but you're eating in phases that then dissociate these peripheral organs from the environmental cycle. So you're creating a conflict between what timing is doing in the brain and in the body. Now, I want to just add that in addition to eating, there are many additional, not even fully understood factors in the body that entrain clocks. One of the most important you mentioned is the nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, which innervates organs such as thermogenic fat and skeletal muscle, that system is directly wired to the brain clock.
Mm-hmm.
So any part of the system where there's autonomic innervation will still receive signals that are timed and entrained by light. Whereas the feeding time, shifts a different set of organs.
In other words, certain organ systems are going to be more tightly coupled to the brain clock than other ones.
That's right. So what happens with sleep loss, shift work, jet lag, exposure to blue light at night, all of these kinds of things that are common in modern society, they or snacking at night, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
These are affecting different organs in different ways.
Right.
Some are more vulnerable than others, so to speak.
Let's before getting back into like how all of these things can get scrambled and desynchronized and what can go wrong, let's give people a sense for how to think about this when things are going right. So let's imagine a human or other animals that are on a perfectly consistent pattern, consistent sleep-wake cycle, light-dark cycle, consistent feeding pattern. Can you give us a sense for, say, what's going on in the brain, but also in an organ like the liver throughout a 24-hour period? So you can pick, if we're talking about a nocturnal or diurnal animal, but at some point the animal's awake and it's going to be feeding with some pattern, and then eventually it's going to go to sleep, and then that's going to repeat. What's going on in the sleep, in the waking phase, in the brain, and in a organ like the liver, say?
So let's focus on endocrine systems, because there are many different ways of answering that. Of course, there are many behaviors that are related to clock functions, such as dopaminergic systems. As you know, there are behavioral disorders such as neurologic disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, where features of those disorders are abnormalities in sleep-wake systems. There are mood disorders. There are addictive disorders that exhibit behaviors that are tied to the day-night cycle, meaning compulsive functions or reward seeking may occur particularly strongly in the evening or so forth. Or conversely, depression may associate with differences in the environmental light cycle. So all of these kinds of phenomena can be explained if you focus on different neurologic properties of clocks and different neurons and so forth. But let's just talk about, from a systems level, the endocrine system. So if we start with the brain, the classic kind of brain speak to the body involves the hypothalamus, where the key hormones that regulate reproductive function, the gonadotropins, exhibit rhythmicity. So we know that, the male and female sex hormones, androgen and estrogen, exhibit very strong rhythmicity. If you go to the doctor and there's any problem with reproductive function or any question of like hypogonadism, it's very important to test those hormones early in the morning, right? Because
Mm.
the phase of analysis of the hormone is very much dependent on the time of day when you draw the blood. So if we suspect that somebody has a problem with producing androgen at a certain age, we often see as endocrinologists, somebody came in 2 in the afternoon, their testosterone was tested and it was somewhat below normal, but we know that testosterone has a very strong circadian rhythm. And so you have to check it depending on when a person normally wakes up
Right.
in proximity to that time. Another example is, in individuals in whom we suspect an abnormality in glucocorticoid, which is one of the stress hormones. So there are tumors that cause the overproduction of stress hormone. This is called Cushing's syndrome. So one of the classic signs of Cushing syndrome is an inappropriate elevation of the hormone in the nighttime. Okay, normally
Yeah.
the hormone rises in the morning, stress hormone, as you wake up. It helps probably with the change in posture and the adaptation to an erect posture from lying down during sleep to standing. That causes hemodynamic changes, and some of those are accommodated by the production at certain times of day of mineralocorticoid hormones, which are derived from the same chemistry as glucocorticoids and glucocorticoids themselves. And these also affect metabolism. So glucocorticoid affects liver metabolism of sugar and production of triglyceride. And it is strongly rhythmic. And the reason for that rhythmicity is that the central pacemaker, the central part of the brain that controls all of the hormone systems is, as we said earlier, tied into these signals from the clock. So we said androgens and estrogens. We talked about glucocorticoids. The same thing is true of thyroid hormone. There is some oscillation there. And so we're aware of these changes as, physicians, and we experience them, daily, in our lives as human beings, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of where we start in the brain. Now, there are things that we're not aware of because the autonomic nervous system is the part we call it autonomic, which has to do with its automaticity, which means it occurs without our conscious thinking, right? And so the sympathetic and parasympathetic arms of the autonomic nervous system also exhibit strong day-night variation. So when we're asleep, there's quiescence of the cardiovascular system that is tied to this daily rhythm in the autonomic nervous system, okay? Now, some of that is directly programmed by the clock itself. Some of it is tied to the function of neurons that are regulating sleep, but they're intertwined, okay? So the quiescence of the autonomic nervous system during sleep is another feature of the day-night rhythms that emanate from the brain and are transmitted to the body. And then in the peripheral organs, if we look using molecular genetic techniques, and the liver is one of the places because it's easy to study where this has been done extensively in Joe's lab, and others have led the charge in this. If you look at the how gene expression rhythms change over the 24-hour day, you can see that thousands of genes that are expressed in the body, and if you take the liver as an example, actually vary over a very, close day-night cycle. So 24-hour periodicity, thousands of genes are expressed, and of those, more than 10% exhibit day-night variation, okay? And in the liver, if you look at those factors that are exhibiting this day-night variation, and they're enriched in factors controlling metabolism, intermediary metabolism. So most of the enzymes involved in what we call, mitochondrial respiration or the digestion of nutrients of each class, proteins, lipids, etc. These are all processes that are very tied to this 24-hour periodicity and the clock in the liver. And the same is true across other tissues, such as adipose tissue, where heat generation occurs in a 24-hour cycle, or muscle, where exercise capacity varies very much according to when in the cycle one, studies exercise capacity.
So the time of day really matters in terms of how you would interpret results, whether you're talking about the results of a study that's reported in the literature or the results of blood work that someone might get at home, get done at the doctor, or from some of the at-home blood tests that people are taking now. Can you talk a little bit about how time of day effects come into play here? And there's two I want to ask you about that we can talk about separately, but also together. So there's the concept of time restricted feeding and only eating for a certain window in the day. And then there's just like the general idea of how consistent your feeding schedule is. How do these two things start to affect metabolic health generally? Whether or not I'm eating at the same time every day, but then also whether or not I'm eating within a certain window of the waking part of the day.
So I want to begin by giving a proviso, which is that, in answering your question, which is that a lot of the discussion of this topic in the popular literature and what obviously is top on our minds as individuals when we are trying to understand this question is intertwined in ways that are not helpful and somewhat confusing with the phenomena of how dieting works. Okay. So calorie restriction and dieting and the theme of when we eat are concepts that have been muddled together. Okay. So I'll address that with you, but I want to get back to the principles of timing and energetics, because I think as principles, there is a more straightforward way of considering it. So we probably as individuals all know somebody who's been either in a hospital, an intensive care unit, or in a nursing home, unable to eat, and provided nutrient through a tube or through the veins, right? So almost entirely in conditions the way we run around the world, intensive care units and feeding for people with so-called enteral feeding, almost always in humans, the nutrient is provided when the individual is asleep. Or if we look in an intensive care unit, it would be at night, right? So this is the opposite phase of the phase when we are, as we discussed, normally eating. And the system has evolved to accommodate nutrient at the time that we are awake and eating, not in the way we deliver it under our artificial conditions in hospitals, in nursing homes, and what have you, where feeding is not a capability of the individual because of critical illness. So in the setting of critical illness, that is really one of the best examples, rather than in the confusing area of understanding dieting. So before addressing the time-restricted feeding question as it's thought of in the popular literature, I just want to put in mind that where we know this really violates the system is in the case of critical illness, where nutrient is provided in conflict with the endogenous system. Almost universally, one of the problems that we encounter in taking care of critically ill individuals is severe insulin resistance. So they develop very severe, problems with metabolism. That is a sine qua non of getting tube feeding or enteric feeding, or enteral feeding, or even parenteral feeding, where nutrient is provided in these kinds of cycles that are out of synchrony with the light cycle. Because even in intensive care unit, there is light. Well, this is an instance where really there's a lot of violation of the endogenous signal that goes to the brain, because the retina still receives light, even if an individual is not conscious. So, so this is an aspect, I would say, that as a sort of physician who thinks about circadian biology, is probably lower hanging fruit than the more complicated and kind of scrambled information, I would say, that has come out on time restricted feeding, but we can go into that.
Got it. So one way of compressing some of what you just said is that if you put food into your body, if food is put into your body at a time when you're normally asleep and not when you're normally awake, which is when you would naturally eat, you see very quick and very strong metabolic effects, including insulin resistance.
That's right. So it's deleterious. That's very clear.
Mhm.
We know that.
And is
Now,
that a fast effect? Does that happen almost immediately?
it's pretty fast. I
Yeah.
mean, the answer is yes. Now there are reasons why we do that. So enteric feeding, um, it's always a balance of what's the relative worst thing that's going on. And there are problems in the gastrointestinal system in individuals who are lying down, for instance, or at rest. So there are times when positioning people is easier to do in such a way as to prevent reflux or choking or aspiration. So it's a balance of things, but from the principle of metabolism, that is an example of where we know that we violate the system and it exhibits its properties.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now, so let's talk about the other thing. So back to the way I think of it. So when we started studying the original animals with mutations in the clock, one of the things that we observed was that they were becoming obese, but their eating pattern also changed, which is that even though they were entrained to light, meaning they were mostly awake at a time that could be predicted based on when light went on, okay? Meaning these are nocturnal animals. So the same would be true in humans. We could say if we had mutations in the clock that affect, if yet their individuals are maintained in a normal light cycle, then we can overcome by forcing entrainment through the light cycle. It's only when we place the animal in constant darkness and there's no light to entrain the system that the manifestations of these mutations really are most evident. That an animal that is maintained without any light signal, if there's a problem in the clock machinery, then it will become completely desynchronized. Now, what we saw was that if we had these mutations, animals no longer are able to time their eating in alignment with their sleep-wake cycle. That was something that we saw. So we went on, we also made around the same time the observation that if we simply place animals on a high-fat diet, okay, normal animals, their clock system begins to show signs of, I would call it fatigue or damage. So as animals are exposed to high-fat diet, their normal sleep-wake pattern is degraded, it deteriorates. And they exhibit, if you look at their organs, changes in the molecular expression of the core clock factors. Okay, now that was an early observation about 20 years ago. And from that, it followed that we thought, okay, the animals, as they consume high fat diet and become obese, begin to eat when they should be sleeping. And then we did an experiment where we only provided them access to high fat food either during the light period when they should be, well, during the period when they should be awake or during the period when they should be asleep. So we were able to control the access to food to those distinct phases of the day and night and provide them with isocaloric, exactly the same amount of food, okay? And what we saw was animals that are provided an identical amount of high-fat food when they should be asleep gain much more weight than animals that are provided the exact same amount of diet when they should be awake, okay?
Mhm.
So that suggested that there's a relationship between the capacity to dissipate energy to release energy from food depending on when in the cycle the animal eats.
Yeah. So that was different. The timing was different, but it was the same amount of food, the same
That's right.
calories.
So those two conditions that establish the principle that the time when an animal eats has a strong effect on energy balance. And energy balance from a thermodynamic standpoint can be thought of as always an equilibrium between the amount of energy that goes into the system and the amount that comes out. And obviously, that's the equilibrium that we exist in as well. So what we then were aware of was that the clock is affecting this balance between energy in and energy out. So this thermodynamic equilibrium that establishes energy balance is influenced by this clock dial, in other words. And how is that happening, is something that we're working on. Now, so the popularization of time-restricted feeding is just blossomed after these original observations. But the problem with that, with a lot of the literature in humans has been that the question has been asked, well, if we time when we eat, can we be more effective in dieting? But the logic of that is not the same as the logic of saying that eating the same amount at different times is exerting different effects when we have too much food. Okay, so in the context of nutrient excess, when we restrict calories, and there we have a very different set of variables. So it's not simply energy dissipation that differs. It's the adaptation to energy restriction. And we know much less about that. The problem is much more complicated because fasting, which is what we're talking about when we do these long calorie restricted, time restricted feeding studies, fasting then becomes a variable. And there are many aspects to fasting biology, such as the process of autophagy, which is digestion of protein in a cell, and other phenomena that kick in that may have nothing to do with the clock system. And so it's very difficult to control. And in humans, any kind of dieting, the effects of reducing energy intake are so much stronger than any other variable that we can't separate these. So there's very little understood if you really scratch the surface under the time restricted feeding literature, if it's asking the question about calorie restriction. There are some special instances, such as if you look at diabetes in individuals with diabetes or pre-diabetes, and you provide them with food at different times of the day, there's good evidence that this affects their glucose homeostasis response. And now we know that when people wear continuous glucose monitors and eat at different times of day, their response to glucose is quite different and variable, or to meals. But so we know that there is this relationship. We know that it's very particularly evident in the context of people with abnormalities related to diabetes. But when we're just talking about weight loss, which is where the popular interest resides, the variables are more complex. And I think there's been a lot of mixed and incorrect messaging about this, this issue.
Mm-hmm. So you're really interesting because you're a physician scientist. You understand feeding behavior and circadian stuff. You also understand the hormone biology, the endocrinology, and all of this stuff. When you sort of just step back and you think about what most people care about, as you said, weight loss, and you think about things like the obesity epidemic, if you were just talking to the average, ordinary people out there who just want to lose some weight, what's your perspective when it comes to saying, some people will say, look, it's pretty much all about energy balance, calories in, calories out. You just got to move more and eat fewer calories. That's the key. And other people say, well, that's not the whole story. Your hormones matter, the timing matters, all of these things matter. It's not just about calories in, calories out. What's your basic perspective on this in terms of how the average ordinary person should think about things like weight loss? Is the needle going to be moved most by merely thinking about calories in, calories out, or do they need to take consideration of other things like timing and like their nutrition beyond just caloric content?
Okay, so I'm going to go against my own sort of wisdom or the field that I'm in by really emphasizing that in humans, far and away, the most important variable is calories in. Okay, now, as far as the evidence, there's no such thing as saying that there's a difference that there's something more to the problem than calories in and calories out. That is complete gobbledygook. So that would be saying that we can violate the laws of thermodynamics, right? So I think that messaging is incorrect. Okay, what we know is that the programming of systems that regulate appetite, which affects food consumption, energy in, and the systems that regulate energy out, which is energy dissipation in the form of exercise or non-exercise induced thermogenesis, those phenomena are influenced by the circadian system, by the timing system. So the time of eating in relationship to the sleep-wake cycle matters within the context of understanding the laws of thermodynamics, the fact that this has to be accounted for based on input and output into the system. But within the system, the timing aspect affects appetite drive, hunger, and the capacity to dissipate energy. I want to just also point out, though, in humans, there's a great degree of controversy about the contribution of energy expenditure to energy balance. So most of the evidence in humans that's clear has emphasized the contribution of variable energy intake. And the response, clearly differs depending on the nutrient content of diet, meaning carbohydrate elicits a greater insulin secretory response. That has effects on appetite. It has effects on energy balance and so forth. So nutrient content of diet matters, and the energy density of diet matters. But, if you look at, for instance, the class of incretin hormones, which are affecting body weight, very potent drugs, the majority of their weight reducing effects can be accounted for by the reduction in energy intake.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And
but I want to make one aside to that, which is that, on the other hand, understanding recidivism, meaning weight gain once the drugs have stopped, has everything to do with understanding the neuroendocrine adaptation to weight loss, which is affecting energy expenditure in addition to energy intake.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What kind of adaptations are actually occurring?
Well, so we know that as one gains weight, this system in the brain that sets our energy balance is adjusted to the higher weight for reasons that are enigmatic, not well understood. And what that means is that, so we've evolved to acquire and possess energy, not to survive. The system has evolved to avoid starvation, right?
Yes, yeah.
So,
we're much more prone to overstore.
That's right. So all of our genetic, drive is to acquire and preserve energy stores. So as we reduce energy stores, the adaptation is to conserve and reacquire, conserve, and regain what we've lost. So that adaptation involves these deep parts of the brain that are interconnected with the clock system. So I think where the clock will come into play is going to be not so much in dieting and weight loss per se, but in the effective weight loss on the maintenance of weight loss following the weight reduced state. In the weight reduced state, the challenge of maintaining a reduced weight, that is the condition where many of these kinds of factors have not been tested and probably are more important. Most of what we hear about and is discussed in the literature has to do with, and in the popular press and so forth is, what's the best diet? That's all focusing on losing weight. But the real problem in our brain and in our bodies is not just how do we lose weight, but if we've reduced our weight, how do we maintain that weight reduced state? Because the program in the brain has evolved to ignore our best efforts to maintain that weight reduced state.
Yeah, because for most of evolutionary history, starvation was a real threat. Food supply was variable, unpredictable. So everything's biased towards, acquire and store as much as you can while it's present.
Yeah. So another way of thinking this, just to throw in another image and metaphor and, food for thought, so to speak. There's a lot of interest in basic biology in the phenomena of torpor, animals that go into hibernation. Okay. Now, as we know, this is a photoperiodic phenomena where, depending on the day length, this is what cues and activates the system that activates torpor, right? So the animal goes into a hypometabolic state. Now, again, so the phenomena are, we are not bears, obviously, but we share many genes and many systems. And we're talking about very overlapping areas of the brain. What kicks in the response to photoperiod that activates hibernation in a hibernating species is in some ways analogous to what we talk about when we think of how do we understand the phenomena of weight maintenance at different body weight set points.
Mhm.
And why is it that sensing light may have some influence on this? So this is a broader question that in other models of biology may be provocative. And I think for my own thinking, it is helpful to remember that there are some principles that may have been well studied in some of these contexts that are relevant for human biology.
Mhm. So as an endocrinologist and as a researcher, what is your general perspective on the new weight loss drugs that are being used by a lot of people now, the GLP-1s? I mean, obviously they're effective for some substantial portion of people who take them. They're eating less basically and then losing weight. What is your perspective on these, especially in regards to long-term chronic use? Are you optimistic that people will be able to safely use these for years on end potentially? Are there any sort of red flags or things we should look out for in terms of things that might be problematic about chronic use of these types of drugs? What's your general perspective on that right now?
That's a different, I mean, I would be opining on something that is not within the realm of clocks. So I just want to give that,
Mhm.
say that. So now we're entering, my general sort of opinion as a, endocrinologist and, person educated in this area of biology. I would say this is the first class of drugs that affects, the very fundamental pathways that drive appetite. I think we know in other contexts that where drugs have been developed, such as antidepressants, SSRIs, other major areas where drugs have really transformed health, and many people have benefited. There's been a lot of fear. I would say that we don't really know the answer. I think there are questions about tolerance, what we call tachyphylaxis. So, in other words, there is usually a plateau in the response. So, what's the reason for that? And then, as I said, as we talked about before, what is the reason for the weight regain after losing weight? I don't think we've learned enough about that yet. And I think um, the challenges with the drugs, now are the loss of lean mass in addition to fat mass, and the information that we don't yet understand about what these mechanisms are that drive the um, weight regain, uh, neurobiology in response to weight loss. That we really don't understand still. And I think in the long term, in order to have stable therapeutics that can be taken um, without secondary and really addressing this problem requires better understanding of that.
Mhm, mhm. When we think about the synchronization of all of our organs and having a consistent versus an inconsistent schedule and stuff, many people have had the experience of flying to that different time zone that's several hours away, or perhaps you just stay up late on a Friday night or a holiday or something, and for whatever reason you're going to consume food at a time when you would normally be asleep. Let's imagine someone has a consistent schedule week by week. They're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the same time at the appropriate time. They're going to bed and waking up at the same time. Everything's very consistent. And then, you stay up late for a birthday party or whatever. So you're going to be eating at a time you would normally not be eating. You would normally be asleep. What exactly is going to be happening or not happening in your GI tract and with organs like the liver that's going to change how that food is digested and stuff? like is the liver secreting less digestive enzymes? Is gut motility lower than it would otherwise be? Can you just paint a picture for people of concretely, like, how is that food going to be handled differently or suboptimally by the body when you eat at that inappropriate time?
Well, let me just say in I want to emphasize that, occasionally undergoing shifts, the system is highly malleable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are otherwise healthy, and by that I mean, physically active, um, generally speaking, eating on a regular schedule, or, this is the exception rather than the frequent occurrence, then I think the likelihood is that, these are small fluctuations that can be accommodated easily. But, in situations where, let's say, there's reflux or there are other problems, motility is affected by autonomic nervous system and by distension of the gastrointestinal tract. Enzyme secretion, I would say we know more about endocrine hormone secretion, which would be insulin and principally insulin. So the insulin secretory response, I think this becomes more important in the context of individuals, say, who have insulin deficiency or diabetes. So I think there people understand and are able to monitor better because of the continuous glucose monitoring available. But anybody with type 1 diabetes will recognize that, depending on what the nutrient content is of what they're eating and the time of day when they are consuming it, and the relationship to physical activity in proximity to the meal, whether it's before or after, all of those variables, which we've talked about as being related to day-night variation, are familiar to individuals who are accustomed to handling their own metabolic responses. And I think it's most important in that context, understanding how to maintain glucose stability in individuals with diabetes. So, the content of the meal is affecting the insulin secretory response. It affects glucose uptake in muscle. It affects the release. You were referring to digestive enzymes from the exocrine pancreas or the cycles of cholesterol metabolism in the liver. Each of these kinds of features of nutrient storage and energy expenditure are related to the clock and the time of day when we eat.
Mm-hmm. When we when we think about time of day effects and some of the circadian biology here, one thing that comes to mind is when we're looking at the literature, say we're looking at the clinical literature and we're comparing across studies, you might have studies that are similar. They're doing similar measurements and investigating similar things, but they come to different conclusions or they show different results and things appear to be conflicting. How much out there in like the clinical literature or the literature broadly speaking can be accounted for by time of day effects? Is there a lot of literature out there where the discrepancies between studies might be explained by, say, just having done them at different times of the day or different times of subjects' cycles?
I mean, absolutely. And, that information is still emerging in a variety of contexts, not only, not I would say metabolism may be one of the most forgiving, but another area where there's some very provocative information emerging pertains to the administration of cancer drugs, which
Hmm.
the liver not only produces enzymes which digest nutrients that we absorb, but it produces many of the pathways that metabolize drugs, either activating or inactivating them, are elaborated in the liver, in the mitochondria or the other organelles. So these enzymes exhibit strong day-night variation, and there have been some smaller studies. I think the consensus isn't there, but there's evidence that suggests certain kinds of chemotherapy drugs may be influenced by the time of day. Surgical interventions may be influenced. There's some evidence on cardiac bypass surgery. There's some recent evidence and a lot of interest in immunology. We know that asthma attacks tend to occur at night and are most severe at night. So why is that? We don't really fully know, but we know that there are strong rhythms in the circulation of immune cells that are probably synchronized with the autonomic rhythm, day-night rhythm. So the release of cells from the bone marrow and also from the spleen is very much influenced by the time of day. So there's a very wide range of phenomena that have been invisible, as you point out, because these haven't been controlled as variables in studies, whether that's in the experimental literature where, even in most studies experimentally in diabetes or obesity are done in mice, and mice are often studied during the time when they normally are asleep. And so, we don't know how much of a confound there is in many of these studies. Um, and likewise, many studies of, of diet or even glucose metabolism are performed without controlling this variable. So yeah, the answer is it's out there, but I don't want to be evangelical and say we don't have strong content from literature that's existing. I
Yeah,
just want
yeah.
it's a variable that hasn't been integrated into our thinking.
Yeah, yeah. But it sounds like a very important thing for people to be aware of is that basically anything you do, whether it's a medical intervention like a surgery, or whether it's a medication you might need to swallow and take every day, all of these things are probably going to be impacted at some level to some degree by the timing here. Are there any basic heuristics you would offer to people in terms of, and I know there's not going to be one singular answer that covers everyone in all contexts, but lots of people are taking lots of different medications. Is it generally better in some way to take them earlier in the day, later in the day with a meal? Like how should people start to think about these things, or do they just need to sort of do trial and error when it comes to that stuff?
No, so I think those kinds of answers are, filling the public with misinformation. So
Hmm, hmm.
I would say anybody who's taking medications, they're working with their physician, are in good hands if they're with a good physician. I think anybody who goes out on a sort of, you know, carnival barking about what the latest news is in the clocks, time restricted feeding is the only way to go. And there are all these books about this. And, a lot of that is misinformation just as much as it may have strains of truth to it. So I think, moderation in digesting new information is important, skepticism. I think um, there, where, as I mentioned, one would hope that this would begin to get studied systematically, I think is in the context of a critical illness. That's one area. So that's not, we know that taking cholesterol medications in the evening is important, and that has to do with the rhythm of cholesterol synthesis in the liver.
Hmm.
So that is why that's a recommendation. That's just one example. As I mentioned earlier, we know that sex hormone production varies across the day-night cycle. That we know that glucocorticoids vary. So any individuals taking glucocorticoid replacement have been instructed very carefully as to what time in relationship to when they wake up, they take their dosing. So those are examples where the the knowledge, translates directly into therapeutics. If you look at the broad range of approved drugs, I don't think we can make a general statement. I would
Hmm.
just say it's one of several variables that is emerging in the literature and under study.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. What are some of the things either that you're working on in your lab today or that the field is working on where you think we're going to make important inroads in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years in terms of sort of the interface between circadian biology and metabolic health? What are some of the big questions that are out there that we don't know the answers to yet that you think we will relatively soon?
That's a tough question. I'm not somebody working at the exact intersection that you're talking about. If you're saying 1 to 2 years, I think that means there's a drug that's about to be approved by the FDA. I would step back from that. I would say that, in broad strokes, our understanding of the mechanisms and biology of sleep is emerging. There are a lot of advances. Is that going to translate right away? I wouldn't project 1 to 2 years, but I think in our generation, the delivery of medications based on a more molecular understanding of the process may happen. I do think that related to the question of weight regain from a weight reduced state, that knowledge from the clocks area will cross-fertilize other areas, and that this the way to enhance the efficacy of the available weight loss medications is an area where we may see changes that are related to the clock's field in the 5 to 10 year horizon. But I don't want to be prognosticating, the future in terms of what the FDA will approve.
Got it. What exactly are you getting at there? Could it be important as to when people take those medications each day?
The mechanisms in the brain that adjust or that tell us without a meaning that are adjusted according to what our body weight is. So when we gain weight, the place where that readout is occurring is intertwined with the place where we receive information about light, the light cycle. And that part of the brain, those pathways are clearly intertwined. I think that the availability of these new drugs brings us much closer to getting at the principles of what it is that causes weight regain following weight loss. And I think that area is where there may be additional insights and mechanisms from the clock's field that come into play.
Yeah. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave people with, or anything you want to reiterate from our discussion today?
Well, I think when we think about time-restricted feeding, if we think of it as a way of maintaining the success of a diet, if we think about that as a practice rather than a solution, not a magic cure, but a practice to maintain our health, I think that's a good way of thinking of it. I think to reduce weight, it's I don't think that we can argue that the answer lies in the clock itself. Behavior modification is a very potent tool to losing weight. So the time-restricted diets probably largely are a form of behavior modification that make it easier for us to reduce our calories. So even though the reason why they work may really have to do with adherence to dieting, that's fine. So if time-restricted eating works and it helps people lose weight, that is totally fine. But I think the reason for that has to do with its effect on behavior. It's easier for us to follow that as a behavior modification to reduce our calories. So I don't want to eliminate the concept from what people think of when they think about ways to reduce weight or be healthy. But I just want to highlight that this is useful, and it's useful both as a behavior to get you to eat less and also as a behavior to reduce weight, to maintain that reduced weight. And likewise, I think this idea that caution with regard to our what we call social jet lag, which is the habit of changing our sleep cycle or the time when we eat over the weekends, when we don't have to wake up as early for work, and then shifting back to the weekday, a different cycle, that is similar in effect to jet lag. So I think particularly as we age, or if we have other ailments, or people who have developed metabolic diseases, in these kinds of circumstances, maintaining the schedule throughout the week, including on the weekends, really has benefits. And we know that sleep hygiene and sleep health are very much important in health throughout life. So I think it's an exciting area. There's a lot of intersection between what's come out of the world of molecular biology and arriving now in understanding human biology. And I think it's going to be an opportunity for development in the future.
All right. Well, Dr. Joe Bass, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, a great way to support my efforts is to visit my support page at mindandmatter.substack.com. A link to that page is in the episode description, or you can search for it on the Substack page itself. The support page has an up-to-date list of my affiliate partners. These are companies I work with, and if you buy those products through those links or using the discount codes provided, those will get you a great deal on a variety of products related to optimizing physical, metabolic, or mental health and vitality. These are all products I use myself, and some of them are directly related to podcast episodes or formulated by Mind and Matter guests. For example, there's a great product called Keto Citra, formulated by a kidney biologist who is on episode number 186. It contains the ketone body BHB together with several minerals in a precise ratio formulated with kidney health in mind. There are also links to products like physical technology devices to track your metabolic health, digital applications to help you find and learn about food and consumer products, and more. One product I use every day is the AquaTrue water filter. I recommend this to everyone because it gets everything out of your drinking water: heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, microplastics, you name it. Other charcoal or gravity-based filters that a lot of people use don't get everything out, they just get some of the stuff out. So I really like the AquaTrue product. You can look for a link to my affiliate partners on my support page or directly in the episode description to this episode, or you can go to mindandmatter.substack.com to find it there.